Hello. Welcome to the Reimagining Schools Learning for Global Citizenship session. We are joined by three incredible panelists who are addressing how to best prepare the next generation to be effective global citizens. The conversation today will explore the key questions. What is global citizenship education? And how does the field of restorative practices help us to address global, national, and local challenges impacting the well-being of all of our citizens? Before I introduce our panelists, I want to thank our conference sponsors, Open Society Foundation and the New Press, for making this event possible. The New Press amplifies progressive voices for a more inclusive, just, and equitable world. A nonprofit public interest publisher, the New Press is a font of progressive thought, leveraging books, diverse voices, and media engagement to enrich public discourse, defend democratic moral values, and facilitate social change. Home to leading progressive thinkers, journalists, scholars, political leaders, and activists, the New Press supports social movements and drives narrative change with books on criminal justice, education, labor, immigration, racial equity, media reform, economic inequality, gender, civic engagement, and democracy. Please visit thenewpress.com to experience the breadth of voices contributing to a more inclusive, just, and equitable world. So to start, we'd love to know where our attendees are located. Please take a moment to put that in the chat, the city, the state, or the country where you are joining us from today. And Pat, I think maybe you were going to let us know where folks are coming from as they come in.
I will, Julia.
All right, thanks. Are people hearing me? Because I'm not seeing anything in the chat. Is that because I'm not supposed to see it? Oh, I see a hello. Well, I see it from Pat.
Yeah, I'm not seeing the chat either.
I have a bunch of panelists raising their hand. The chat is disabled. Oh, here we go. Now it's coming through. All right.
So we have people joining us from Costa Rica, from Maine, more Canadians, Maryland, Vancouver, Canada. Oh, it's coming in fast and furious now. So clearly the chat issue got worked out.
Yeah, I saw Hungary. I saw South Africa. All right.
Well, wonderful.
Welcome, everyone. We really want to encourage you to participate actively in the chat. When you do chat, please be sure to select all panelists and attendees. Remember that the closed captioning is available for this session if you choose to select it. Please share your questions through the QA button so that we can make sure not to miss any of them. We really hope that you enjoy this session. So now I'd like to introduce each panelist. So panelists, when I say your name, if you want to go ahead and turn on your camera, and then I think our attendees will be able to see you. So first is Libby Giles. Libby is there she is the Education Director for the Centers of Asia Pacific Excellence at the University of Waikato in Hamilton, New Zealand. She's the director of the New Zealand Center of Global Studies and a co-founder of Global Citizenship New Zealand. She is a specialist global citizenship education practitioner and consultant with considerable experience in the field of transformative education. Her approach to global citizenship education is centered in philosophical inquiry and responsibility. Libby seeks to empower and equip young people with the knowledge and skills to think critically, act responsibly, and live well. Libby is committed to meeting local and international educational requirements and goals for transforming education and helping others to do the same by sharing practical experience. All right, our next panelist is Bonnie J. Ricci. There's Bonnie. Welcome, Bonnie. Bonnie has served as the executive director at ICAISA, or the International Council Advancing Independent School Accreditation, since 2019. Independent Schools has served as leaders in developing K through 12 global citizenship pedagogy for decades. ICAISA examines and assesses the evolving educational environment, and it acts as a catalyst for navigating significant change, developing innovative practices, and promoting transformative leadership. Throughout her career, she has held numerous positions with independent schools, including teacher, advisor, coach, and head of school. Analytical by nature, she is intensely service-oriented and derives deep satisfaction through supporting educational community as a board member, the educational community as a board member, conference presenter, facilitator, consultant, and enthusiastic advocate for accreditation and independent school education. All right. And third, we have Dr. Paul Sherman. There he is. Dr. Paul Sherman's the head of the Community Social Services Program and the founding director of the Soka Education Research Center on Global Citizenship. Both are located at the University of Guelph-Humber in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Prior to joining the University of Guelph-Humber, Dr. Sherman worked as a clinician and senior administrator in diverse community mental health settings for over 30 years. His doctoral research examined global citizenship education in higher education, with a particular emphasis on the cultivation of global citizenship identity and engagement. He continues to teach and conduct research in this area and has published numerous scholarly articles. Dr. Sherman has been awarded research grants from Lancaster University and the University of Guelph-Humber, in addition to long-term funding from the Makaguchi Foundation for Education to establish and develop the Soka Education Research Center on Global Citizenship. Thank you all so much for being here today. Let's go ahead and let's begin our discussion. So, depending on where you place your focus, today's world can seem to be very greatly divided. People who are divided by different cultures, different identities, different experiences, and different worldviews are all trying to occupy the same planet. If we don't intentionally create space for curiosity, dialogue, empathy, and understanding, conflict is likely to increase on both a local and global scale. Each of our panelists is dedicated to developing global citizens and their work involves students from pre-kindergarten all the way up through higher education. So the first question I'd like to ask is for you to briefly describe the work that you are currently engaged in and share really what drew you to the subject of global citizenship education. So Libby, can we go ahead and start with you? Oh, Libby, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Kia ora koutou katoa. That's Te Reo Māori for greetings to all of you. I'll start with how I got to global citizenship education, and many roads led me to my love for and work in global citizenship education, not least of which was an incredible opportunity when I was a young woman on my overseas experience, and I had the opportunity to work for small island states of the United Nations. I was really taken then by the realization that I had come to New York to know that I live in the Pacific. It was also there that I learned the power of the collective. I gained some understanding of the multi-layers of identity, local, regional, and global, and the importance of independence while working together for the common good. On return to New Zealand, I worked for Greenpeace's Pacific campaign, navigating complex issues including waste trade, sea turtles, fishing, deforestation, and nuclear testing. I went on to study politics and philosophy with a master's in international relations and human rights. I then came to teaching with an atypical background, but found a niche. First with setting up philosophy in the school, and then becoming the newly established global citizenship facilitator, even though I didn't really know what that was. Excuse me. There are strong links, as I said, between philosophical inquiry, ethics, and global citizenship. As a UNESCO-associated school, doors really opened up to a wonderful world of people and learning. And that's the world I like to spend a lot of time in now. I've set up 2 whole school models of global citizenship education in high schools and in New Zealand, and my current role as Education Director of the CAPES at the University of Waikato. I lead a wonderful team of professional learning facilitators that has a mandate to support schools to implement global citizenship education within the context of the Asia Pacific. Excuse me.
Shall I go on to the next person, Libby?
Yeah, no, go on. Sorry. Yep.
Thanks, Libby. All right, Bonnie, can we go to you?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Julia. A couple things drew me to global education. First, I would say as an undergraduate, I majored in anthropology. And so I've always been intrigued and interested in other cultures and other environments. And recently I've become fascinated by what's been termed the 4th Industrial Revolution. And a lot of you are probably familiar with that. A lot has been written about this, but sort of a core concept is that with the rapid advances in technology, including AI and various other developments, these developments are not really just changing moderately, but more intensely, they're changing our relationships and our patterns of living. And so I've been interested in how does this play out in our schools, and specifically, are we preparing our students for the demands of this unpredictable future? And another thing that drew me to global education in particular is my work here with ICAISA. I started at ICAISA in 2019, and just a little snapshot about ICAISA. We're a nonprofit organization that upholds standards within the K-12 independent and international school environments. And we work directly with accrediting organizations to ensure quality within schools. And the way we do this is by setting standards for effective accreditation and establishing a set of model core standards that each of the accrediting associations show their alignment to. And so each accrediting association that's part of ICAISA goes through a process that's very similar to a school accreditation process. I imagine a lot of our attendees are familiar with school accreditation. And so at ICAISA, the first I in ICAISA stands for international. And actually a majority of our accrediting association members are based within the US. So ICAISA has been asking ourselves, how can we expand and more fully live into the I of ICAISA? And this has led me to expand my own understanding of international education, specifically at the K-12 level. How are international schools helping to develop this idea of global citizenship or international mindedness? And what are the different ways that schools are doing that, and how are they being intentional about fostering a global mindset within their students? And so I think the last point I'll make here is just that, as I mentioned, ICAISA has a set of core standards. And one of them in particular talks about schools being able to recognize global connectedness and promoting a culture of global understanding. And so that's one of the specific ways that ICAISA intersects with schools and accreditation in general.
Thank you, Bonnie. Paul, can we go to you?
Certainly. Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be at this on this panel. Very important topic, using global citizenship to reimagine education. And I'm coming to you from a very cold and snowy Toronto, Canada. So great to be inside. I'm not outside. That's Niagara Falls. That's a photo behind me. So I first became aware of the term global citizenship over 25 years ago when I read a speech given by Japanese peace activist Daisaku Ikeda at Columbia University Teachers College, entitled Thoughts on Education for Global Citizenship. I was not an educator at that time. In that speech, Ikeda identified three essential elements of global citizenship, namely the wisdom to perceive the interconnectedness of all life, the courage not to fear or deny difference, but to respect and strive to understand people of different cultures and to grow from encounters with them. And lastly, the compassion to maintain an imaginative empathy that reaches beyond one's immediate surroundings and extends to those suffering in distant places. I remember at the time thinking that was a pretty cool way to envision a world where people treated each other with respect and dignity rather than with animosity and violence. In the 1970s, ICAISA founded a private educational system based on Soka, which translates into value creating education, with a vision to foster global citizens who contribute to society and help strengthen the foundations of peace. This ideal resonated with my own ideology on human and societal development and inspired me to teach undergraduate courses in global citizenship and value creating education, as well as conduct research in these areas. I'm particularly interested in global citizenship identity and engagement, and I'm currently doing a cross-cultural study on what motivates students who identify as global citizens to participate in global citizenship activities. And a second study, another cross-cultural research study, this one a collaborative exchange project with Japanese and Canadian students that explores ways that students can address the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. All right. Well, as I mentioned in the beginning, I'm an oh, actually, I don't think I did mention this, by the way. I'm Julia Getty. I'm an instructor and implementation coach for the IIRP. I meant to say that earlier. Since I am in that role, I know that when we train educators in restorative practices, we stress the importance of being explicit and intentional. We really want to make sure that people aren't wasting valuable time and energy pursuing projects and methods that are not proven or that are ineffective. So I'd love to ask the three of you, and we'll start with Bonnie and then we'll go to Paul and then Libby. What do you see as the critical components, the must-haves of global citizenship education? How can these then also be actualized in a school or campus setting? So the must-haves. Bonnie, let's start with you.
Sure. A couple thoughts on this, and I think some of these thoughts will echo what Libby and Paul shared in their introductions. Really, global citizenship education is by definition about empowerment and empowering all students to become global citizens. And so, in my opinion, there's some skills in particular that are the must-haves. Not surprisingly, one of the first ones I would highlight would be communication. And that's face-to-face communication, written communication, digital communication, cross-cultural communication. That's really essential. And so schools need to be reinforcing that in their approaches and in the curriculum. Another must-have is to instill in students the desire to have an impact in kind of whatever their passions, where their passions lie. There's some recent work been done on purpose learning, and I think that's really essential here. That figuring out one's purpose is not a linear path, but rather a circuitous path. And so normalizing that. The fact that we all are lifelong learners. And so these are skills and habits of mind that should be reinforced. We heard earlier a little bit about sort of a curiosity around diversity. Years ago, we used to talk about tolerance, but now it's about moving from tolerance towards curiosity and towards openness. And this is what leads to an individual to have a deep understanding of the broader world beyond one's immediate environment. Similarly, one of the must-haves is skills for how to build a network, how to engage effectively with colleagues and fellow students, teamwork, collaboration. These are really essential. And then a couple of particular things, and these wouldn't necessarily be must-haves, but I think interesting approaches. One would be the idea of apprenticeships, and starting at a fairly young age. What are those opportunities where we can expose students to the quote unquote real world or to the real work settings? And in doing so, we create kind of wider pathways towards success, whether that's higher ed or different pathways towards fulfilling your purpose. I think that normalizing that is really important. And I think ultimately, before I talk a little bit about how some of these can be actualized, I would say at its core, one of the must-haves is instilling in our students both a desire and a responsibility to make change. And so just a couple thoughts on how these habits and mindsets can be actualized. And again, many of our attendees are probably living this work as we speak in their classroom settings or in alternative environments as well. One would be really diving into new modes of teaching and learning, whether that's experiential learning, competency-based learning, project-based learning. These are all sort of often dubbed 21st century approaches, new curriculum and new areas of exploration. One example of that would be sort of data science and data analytics. Student agency is really important here, voice and choice. And as I said earlier, getting out of the classroom and into the world, and technology can help us do that when we're not able to leave the four walls of our classrooms. And then just a couple other thoughts. One would be the importance of the teacher pipeline. Who are we attracting to the teaching profession? And how can we really ensure that the best and the brightest are interested in becoming educators and in influencing the future? And then finally, because I am always wearing an accreditation hat, I have to put that on as well and say in particular that I think accreditation can and should be a critical part of any individual school's journey towards, improvement and evolution in this area. So I would pause there, and those are some initial thoughts.
Great, thank you so much, Bonnie. So as I mentioned earlier, we'll go to Paul next. And Paul and Libby, I do recognize that you may be thinking some of the exact same things that Bonnie was saying, so feel free to handle that however you like. You don't have to delve into it twice or three times if Bonnie already mentioned it. But Paul, what do you think?
Sure, there's nothing wrong with repeating. It serves to confirm, and
True.
I'm sure
True.
I'll be confirming some of what Bonnie said. I'm going to address this from a post-secondary education perspective because that's the arena that I teach and research in. But I'm pretty sure that some of these ideas could be easily transferred to K-12. So post-secondary education has a responsibility to help students develop a global citizenship ethic by promoting global awareness and cultivating a critical understanding of one's place in an increasingly globalized society. Equally important to students' perspective taking and identity development as global citizens, however, is the provision of opportunities to participate in global citizenship activities that can serve to develop a sense of social or civic responsibility as someone who contributes to making their local community and world a better place to live. And I look at global citizenship education through the lens of two broad pedagogical approaches. One is education about global citizenship, and the other is education for global citizenship. Although there can be some overlap, and there is some overlap, the former, which is education about global citizenship, typically entails practices that provide students with an understanding of the concept of interconnectedness, of relevant and contemporary global issues, as well as the customs and traditions of multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multi-faith populations. It's an important initial approach for teaching global awareness, as it gives students a platform for identifying and connecting with unknown others around the world. Education for global citizenship, on the other hand, goes beyond knowledge transfer and involves the integration of applicable skills, values, and attitudes that are germane to encouraging active global citizenship engagement. In this approach, students are provided with opportunities for experiential learning, such as volunteering locally and internationally, studying abroad, and developing initiatives that help them to connect local and global issues. My own research in this area suggests, for example, that after participating in short-term study abroad, post-secondary students significantly strengthen their views of global citizenship, their endorsement of pro-social values, and their inclination to participate in global citizenship activities. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Libby?
Kia ora. First of all, I think there are so many crossovers with what Bonnie and Paul have already said, but actually, reinforcing all of those ideas is nothing but good. We have to take values-based education seriously, and we have to get better at the complex. So I think for me, the starting point is understanding who the global citizen is. These words get thrown around a lot, and I think it's really important to delve in and explore that. It's not a new concept, it's a very, very old one. Indigenous peoples and ancient civilizations have always known that they're responsible for everyone and everything. And in a modern day environment, by definition, none of us are, like legally, none of us are global citizens with no world government to bestow rights on us. So the only thing that gives legitimacy to the notion is our behavioral responsibility. The other thing that's really important for me is understanding the move from international to global. So, we've always been global citizens, but the last 450 years of the state system have kind of taken us away a bit from that, perhaps. And now, increasingly, we are forced into a position of recognizing actually that we have a planetary interest. So I see global citizenship very much not as a subject, but as a conceptual lens and framework through which to advance knowledge, skills, and wisdom to be responsible global citizens. So within the CAPES framework that we have for educating teachers on global citizenship, there are three big ideas that underpin the framework, and those are identity, connections, and responsibility. And so those three ideas actually connect really nicely with three Māori principles and the first one is tūranga waiwai, is to understand the place I stand, kaitiakitanga, which is about responsible guardianship, and whakapuawai, which is flourishing ever forward. So the responsibility is about us understanding our relationships and duties to each other and the environment. And of course, there is responsibility to local and international agreements. In our case in New Zealand, the first document that we need to honour is the one that is the foundation of our country, and that is Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi. So we need to honour our commitments as a bicultural nation and then to the rest of the world. There's also other requirements like our local curriculum, UNESCO's Pillars of Learning, which of course learning to know, learning to do, learning to be, learning to live together, and learning to transform oneself in society. UNESCO's three domains of learning: cognitive, socio-emotional, and behavioural. So I think all of these drivers are really helpful in our journey. They include too the SDGs and the recently revived resolution on education and international understanding, and the recent UN summit on transformative education. These principles and requirements are actualized in school, can be actualized in school through the establishment of whole school global citizenship education. So while there's no set model for global citizenship education, the whole school approach transcends all disciplines and extends beyond the classroom into our everyday lives, into the wider community. It's holistic and values education beyond assessment, developing character and strengths for us to do well and do good. It needs to be located in every aspect of school life, in the vision, strategic direction, goal setting, appraisal, pastoral care, food, transport, wider community, you name it. It gives us that framework gives us the mandate to deliver holistic education to advance knowledge, skills, wisdom, and well-being. So while extending the classroom to the end of the earth and beyond, we're still operating in traditional learning environments, and global citizenship sits there too. Well, not without challenges, but there's lots of opportunities too. I'll leave it there for now because some of this other stuff pops up in my responses, perhaps in the final question.
Okay, thanks, Libby. It's interesting, the way you describe how global education needs to be systemic really reminds me of how we describe restorative practices and how it really needs to not just be done at certain times with certain people and in certain classes. It really needs to be a systemic approach. So thank you for that. So related to that, and of course we are at a conference focusing on restorative practices. The next question is about tying global education in with restorative practices. For this question, Paul, you'll be first, and then we'll go to Libby and then Bonnie. So one important aspect of using restorative practices in the classroom is building capacity, skills, and understanding to form and engage in authentic relationships. So how do you see that relating to global citizen education? So authentic relationships. Paul?
Yeah, so I'm going to first mention some research and then talk about how that research is applied in the daily world with respect to global citizenship. So according to certain theorists, students who are globally aware, and by that meaning that they have an understanding of global interconnectedness or interrelatedness and global affairs, as well as they interact with friends, teachers, and or family who have a global citizenship orientation themselves. These students are more likely to adopt a global citizenship perspective themselves. This is all based on social identity theory. And there is evidence to support the existence of a positive correlation between global citizenship identity and the endorsement of pro-social values or attitudes such as empathy, valuing diversity, helping others, advocating for social and environmental justice, for example. So my research into Soka education practices at Soka University in Japan suggests that educational institutions, and I'm going to use the word that Libby used a bit earlier, holistic or whole, educational institutions that holistically endorse and cultivate a global citizen ethic, of which Soka University is one such institution, produces students who develop the necessary soft skills to form meaningful relationships of compassion and caring for others. On one visit that I had to Soka University, I was told that, I think this was a faculty member who told me this, that most students, faculty, and staff are constantly seeking the meaning of global citizenship. The university's founder, the aforementioned Daisaku Ikeda, has said that Soka education's approach to global citizenship education is, quote, to place a strong emphasis on fostering human and life-affirming values, on peace, and on encouraging students to lead contributive lives, unquote. So at the core of this approach is an emphasis on constructive dialogue and meaningful interpersonal exchanges with others, especially when conflicting points of view are present. Continued and constant dialogue is seen as the most beneficial mechanism for establishing authentic relationships, whether between friends or between geopolitical adversaries. I personally think that educational institutions would do well to model this approach through their global citizenship education practices.
Thanks, Paul. Libby, we'll go with you next, and then Bonnie.
So with restorative practice, so that was really nice, actually. I like that comment about restorative practice like global citizenship being systemic. I'm not directly involved in restorative practice, but I have a number of colleagues who are experts in the field. And when I spoke to one of them yesterday, and I said, look, I don't know, much about this part. And she said, well, I'm not a practitioner of this. And she said, well, you are, because you're working with relationships and systems and so on. So, very much so. So starting to learn a little bit more, I see fantastic opportunities to connect restorative practice and GCED. So the principles are so closely aligned: relationships, responsibility, and communication. Recognizing and listening to unique perspectives at the same time as being part of a whole. I see this really closely connected too with the philosophical idea behind the idea of the modern cosmopolitan or the modern global citizen. And I reference Kwame Anthony Appiah here with his ideas about this, and the idea of universalism plus difference. So while belonging to a moral community, we're entitled to different ways of life. This is talking about global citizenship with two strands. First is the idea that we're all collectively responsible for each other and that we're kind of a single moral community, but that at the same time, we're entitled to different ways of life. So global citizens don't expect everybody to be the same. The fact that there are disagreements around the world should not make us think that we can't live together. This is all about learning to live together. Relationships are crucial in maintaining our identity, making connections, and acting responsibly. So I am really keen to learn more from all of you about integrating restorative practice and GCED. I see it as particularly helpful in the socio-emotional learning domain of global citizenship education. Thank you.
Thanks, Libby. Bonnie?
Yeah, so my my fellow panelists, Libby and Paul, you've really touched on some major themes here, and I think I'll just add a couple thoughts. As both Libby and Paul have shared, both restorative practices and global citizenship education really are intrinsically linked. You can't have one without the other. In order to build authentic relationships, you need to develop the curiosity for others, the appreciation for difference, and the belief that differences are worth celebrating. And I think schools have a responsibility to help students develop those mindsets and those dispositions. Teachers can model this, older students can model this, and this is also why real world experiences are so critical. I think a student's worldview gets expanded when they observe and participate in experiences outside of the classroom. One example of this is an organization here based in Boston called Apprentice Learning. And one of the sort of themes that they offer, actually, I should pause and say that Apprentice Learning offers apprenticeships for students in the Boston Public Schools starting in the 8th grade. And one of the themes that Apprentice Learning built on was this idea of when students, in particular from challenging backgrounds, students that may be experiencing hardships, whether through their neighborhoods or food scarcity or family supports or mental or physical illness, various forms of trauma. Those students, when they look to the horizon of Boston and the city skyline, they see these tall buildings that are often encased in glass and look very glamorous. And, Apprentice Learning wanted to create the environment where those students that were part of these apprenticeships, they felt like they belonged in those tall buildings, and that that those buildings were part of them. And so they had the ability to walk through the doors of these, large buildings. And so again, that's sort of an example of the importance of getting outside the individual classroom. The other thing I'll say in particular about restorative practices is we've heard about how a core component is about appreciating difference and cultivating curiosity. One of the other pieces that I think we haven't touched on yet is this responsibility to be able to identify and communicate one's own needs at any given time, and for how to do that in a way that again supports curiosity but honors what your individual identity is and your sense of self and what you're bringing to the conversation. So I think that's an important theme to underscore there. And then I think the last thing I'll share with regard to this would be a potential framework for schools. And I think this relates obviously to restorative practices, but also global citizenship. And actually it's general enough that you could apply it in many different contexts. And there's, of course, an accreditation element to this as well. But this idea that with any given change, you want to think about how you can get from step A to step B to step C, step D, etc. And so one potential framework, and this comes from some work I did with the Association for the Advancement of International Education. There was a project that I was involved in creating what we called the New School Principles. And as part of that, we created what we called this pathway towards progress. And there's sort of 4 steps. One is as a system, a school might start with thinking about it, whatever the it is, the change or the evolution, and then spending some time digesting the thinking about it part, and then working on it. And then from there, you move towards living it. And then finally, what it would look like in any given change to be a school community or a system that's really transforming as a result of fully embracing that. So I think that model can be really helpful here when we're thinking about restorative practices and global citizenship. So that's what I would share on that.
Great, thank you, Bonnie. I just wanted to take a minute to highlight your mention of apprenticeship. I so appreciate that idea. You know, in our country in education, we've developed a stereotype that you start at kindergarten, you go all the way through 12th grade. If you want to be successful, you have to go to a 4-year college. If you want to be even more successful, you have to go beyond that. You know, we've lost sight of sort of the more hands-on, the more creative ways of developing knowledge and expertise. And so I love hearing this idea of apprenticeships. And I think it ties in with being restorative too, because part of being restorative is recognizing that not everything works for everyone, right? And finding out what is the best, what people need, right? So thank you. All right. Our last question, for this one, Libby, we'll start with you, and then Bonnie, and then Paul. So what advice would you give to a school or organization seeking to start or to improve a global citizenship education initiative? So Libby?
Kia ora, thank you. Okay, so getting started. The kind of advice that I dish out after the experience, based largely on the experiences that I've had, is firstly, give it a name and a home and somebody to look after it. Value what's already going on, start small, communicate well, involve students, engage the wider community, and prioritize well-being. So with the name and a home and someone to look after it, it's really important that this is a sustainable thing, and it's not just one keen teacher who's getting this going and trying to get the whole school on board by themselves, and when they leave, it's gone. So for global citizenship education to flourish, it really must have the full support of and commitment of the school leadership. So the first thing to do is to name it as a whole school initiative, create a leadership role or roles to manage it, and a home for planning, learning, and associated activities. The naming of the initiative is vital to its existence and understanding of its essence. So there are so many opportunities available for students and teachers to participate locally and internationally on global issues, but without somebody to receive the mail and match the people in participation, the opportunities are so often lost. The coordinator can also facilitate professional learning for the rest of within the school for the rest of the teachers and support staff globally and across sectors, and work with students to develop understanding and participation. So the creation of a role like this really allows for the sustainability of the initiative with a supported role rather than an individual at its centre. Something I've found too is making a home for it is really, really important, and libraries can be a really fantastic place to do this. In a school, in my last school, we co-named the library as the Global Commons, as an interdisciplinary space for the love of literature and learning, and a common space for living together, for sharing participation, and so on. It can also be a really great space for supporting teachers and engaging the wider community. Super important, supporting and valuing teachers. One of the biggest challenges is the concern that, the introduction of global citizenship education is something else to pack into an overcrowded curriculum. And that's a really valid concern. So while it's not a subject, but a framework to support what's already going on, it's really important to value what's already going on, and there will be. Global citizenship education will be existing in all parts of the school, and sometimes the least likely ones. So it's not the domain of the social science faculty or any other. So perhaps mapping out the curriculum to see what's going on first and starting to draw those threads together, and what's going on outside the classroom as well, of course. And you can start getting the operations people in and talking about procurement and so on. Professional development opportunities for teachers, absolutely crucial to strengthen pedagogical practice and help to break down silos. I also promote the idea of the facilitation of philosophical inquiry skills, because these really, really help for teachers and students to make connections between subject areas and their own lives. Sharing across year levels is good. In a school where I was at, which was right from the 5-year-olds to the 18-year-olds, the primary schools tend to be more holistic in their pedagogy, and little children tend to have a really beautifully global view. So making sure that we continue that mindset and learning through the senior years. Also making teacher training online, encouraging online training, but there are some fantastic things globally going on. So even if they aren't easily finding local courses to take, but for example, the Asia Pacific Centre for Education and International Understanding has fantastic online courses. And any training through other or connecting through global organisations really helps to make those connections with others, on the same journey. Sharing the sort of, global development and practice. So it's the teachers who will make global citizenship education part of the curriculum, and teachers face a major challenge. They're operating in a linear system that's driven by assessment in a rapidly changing global environment, and that requires a whole education to help students navigate that kind of complexity. So yeah, we do have to worry about those teachers' concerns. They really are valid, and we need to help people understand that this actually isn't something new. This is something that's been in development for a very, very long time. So there will be morphing and some change in language and so on, but it seems like a pretty good path to be on. Get the students on board, really, really important. They get used to the language really quickly, and they will help their teachers in many cases, and parents and other members of the school to get on board. And they will get initiatives going that very quickly become traditions in a school. So a really nice example I had at St. Cuthbert's, which was my last school, is we took what was the Pink Shirt Anti-Bullying Day, and we developed a whole week of love and diversity. And after about 3 years, everybody thought it had been going on for about 20. It became an incredible celebration of diversity of all its kinds, and everybody got on board. So things like that can really, really help to build the culture. My last point really is infiltrate. Sometimes when you're starting something like this, perhaps most people even aren't on board, but go to the people who are. Infiltrate each faculty with the people who are keen to work with, and eventually there'll be a tipping point. So those are my starting tips. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Thank you, everyone.
Wonderful, Libby. Thank you. Bonnie?
Great. Hard to follow that list, Libby. That was phenomenal, and you really captured some fantastic elements there in terms of advice. I really liked what you were saying about engaging teachers in their own professional learning in this area, and I think that's great. The thing I might add would be, or I guess sort of some suggestions would be, for individuals within a school or for schools as a whole, I would say don't start from scratch. If you're looking to start a global citizenship curriculum or component to your school, or if you already have one and you're looking to expand it, there's so many resources out there to support the work. And we've heard obviously from Libby and Paul some specifics around that. I would add a couple books in particular that have been useful for me in my interests in this area. One would be Empowering Global Citizens by Fernando Reimers, and he's at Harvard. And that is, there's so much good information in there, but at its core, it basically outlines a specific K-12 curriculum. It talks about goals and skills and activities and even kind of capstone projects. And just an example of some of the things in there, there's some thematic units. And so at the kindergarten level, the book talks about this theme of our world is diverse and beautiful. And then by the third grade, there's a unit on understanding global interdependence through entrepreneurship in chocolate manufacturing. And then at the high school level, they're starting to get into more critical thinking and analysis, especially around global conflicts and resolutions. So again, don't start from scratch, but you may find that resource in particular very helpful. Another one is a bit more general, less about global citizenship or restorative practices in particular, and more about, as the title invokes, the human side of school change. And this is by Robert Evans, and it's really a go-to for many educators. And I think it offers a real clear explanation of kind of the challenges, the human challenges with change in particular, and how we can support ourselves and as leaders in school communities, how we can support teachers, faculty, administration to evolve and change, and what are the different obstacles and opportunities that any change initiative presents. And so those are two books that I would share. And then in particular, I wanted to share a specific K-12 independent school example. And before I do this, let me share sort of a caveat that there are so many fantastic initiatives and projects and curricula and approaches that are happening, really across the world in this area. And so part of me is reluctant to share one in particular, but I did find this interesting, and that is some of you may be familiar with the Avenues School, and in particular, one of the ways that they describe their curriculum is by talking about the Avenues world elements. And so they piggyback on the idea of the periodic table of elements. And so you can find this on their website, but they've designed or they've captured the sort of habits of mind and mindsets and dispositions for their students or their graduates. And they've documented that to look similar to the periodic table. And there's a whole iconography that goes with it. But two things I would share specifically about that. One is that the first element on that list is empathy. And we've certainly heard today about the importance of that as a mindset. And then the other thing that I think is important, and they spell this out on the website, and that is that as these individual elements, they don't work in isolation, but really the beauty comes from having the elements in their language being combined into molecules. And so this is a way of capturing that, the interdisciplinary approach is so important. And the challenges that are facing us, these global challenges, are not going to be solved from one individual discipline or by one individual person. We're seeing that with recipients of the Nobel Prizes are often lately going to teams of colleagues and collaborators as opposed to individuals. And so I think the Avenues world elements, the way that they've captured that, there's a lot of power in that. So 2 books and a particular school. So hopefully that'll provide some food for thought.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. Libby and Bonnie, there's been a request. If you could put the titles and authors in the chat of the books that you mentioned, or any specific resources, that would be wonderful. Thank you. Paul, you're up.
Okay, I'm not sure I have anything new to add, but I will try. Again, I'm going to rely on my research and teaching experience. And I found through both my research and teaching that the praxis from understanding global citizenship to actually doing global citizenship is often quite challenging for students. It's not uncommon for them to struggle in defining their roles or contributions as global citizens, as expressed, for example, by this student in one of my studies who quite honestly remarked, "I don't think I'm a full global citizen because even though I have had the opportunity to think about global citizenship a lot, I still can't figure out what I should do right now." That was a common sentiment in many of the interviews that I've conducted with students about how they look at global citizenship and how it impacts their daily lives. So educational practices that teach about global citizenship are invaluable, but in isolation, they may limit the capacity of the student to sufficiently and fully engage as a global citizen. To accomplish this outcome, educational curricula would do well to integrate knowledge about global citizenship with learning opportunities that help motivate the student to actively participate as a global citizen. I mentioned some of those earlier. Integrating education about global citizenship with education for global citizenship is the most comprehensive and holistic approach for cultivating both a global citizenship identity and a desire to take proactive action on behalf of both local and global societies. And I'll just add that I've found in both speaking with educators and administrators in post-secondary institutions about global citizenship, and in my own university when trying to implement it holistically here, that one of the most important ingredients is to have a champion or champions of global citizenship within the school setting, preferably among senior leadership, who can advocate and promote this teaching and learning practice within and across the entire school setting. I teach global citizenship courses, and we have a smattering of other types of courses that relate to intercultural communications. But as a whole, at my university, and I suspect it's the same at the vast majority, this concept is not taught to any great extent. And it's very hard for young people, for students to pick up this idea. Unless within their own normative environment, people have this perspective. It's very hard to pick it up at school unless they're being exposed to it on many different levels, multidisciplinary, in their cafeteria, wherever they go. There should be some aspect of learning around global citizenship. So I would say to do that, there has to be champions of global citizenship within the school setting.
All right. Thank you, Paul. And I think what I hear you saying is that this work, all of you saying work needs to be very intentional and explicit. And Paul, I love that comment that you shared from the student, because so many of us have felt that way. You know, like I have the desire, I want to do better, I want to do good things, but I just don't know what to do next. And I think sometimes, you know, we have to just say it's okay. You know, we'll get through this, we'll come together, we'll have conversations, we'll figure it out together. You don't have to have all the answers. So thank you for that. All right. So Paul, if you have any resources you want to add to the chat as well, that would be helpful, but don't feel if you don't have anything to add. And I'm being told we have lots of questions. So Pat, how does this work? are you coming on screen? Are you putting the questions in the chat?
I'll come on screen and share them. There's probably too many for us to get through all of them, so I've tried to combine a few. What a wonderful conversation. So thank you so much, and to the panelists, but also to participants who have put resources in the chat. Yeah, it's been wonderful, very helpful. So we'll start with this question, and it kind of connects to some of the other conversations we've had at the conference so far. But Andre has asked, how do you talk about global citizenship without addressing the harm that has been enacted globally and not talk about justice? And Julia, and panelists, if somebody wants to volunteer on that, or if each of you want to take a turn and share some comments.
Would anyone like to start with that one?
I guess I'll jump in here and thank you. I think it was Andre, you mentioned Pat. Thank you, Andre, for that important question. And I think we may have alluded to this, but we certainly didn't go deep here. But global citizenship is very linked to an individual school's work with regard to diversity, equity, inclusion. And I think, Julia, in the earlier session that I was able to attend, you spoke about how restorative practices has been a core part of diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations all along. So there's a natural synergy there. But I think, Andre, your point is a good one, that absolutely they're connected, and they must be connected. And in terms of the trauma or the harm that has happened and continues to happen globally, I think that has to be a core part of the conversation, and that can happen, again, sort of from the K-12 perspective, that can and should be happening, those conversations at a developmentally appropriate level, starting as early as kindergarten. And so I think I mentioned the theme in Fernando Reimer's book at the kindergarten level is about appreciating the beauty and the differences that we all have. And so I think it can be started. Those conversations can start very, very early.
Thank you, Bonnie. Libby?
Yeah, I think, and I'd quite like to just build on that and connect it to another question that I see there too. So building on that sort of social justice idea, but how this might advantage disadvantaged students or just people in disadvantaged environments. And I think that because I mean, I think it can be seen that this is sort of, this is sort of rather a nice sort of, post-materialist sort of add-on or something. So I think we need to actually look at what we're doing here, and it is, I think, if people understand who they are, if they really have a strong sense of their identity, then they are so much more likely to flourish. And so I think this is a really, really strong strong thing to add in here. And I think in particular when we're talking about Indigenous peoples, so peoples who have had their language and religion and other cultural practices taken away from them, to actually be in a learning environment that is connecting them to themselves and to others, is going to be all part of the journey, hopefully, into sort of building towards social justice.
Thanks, Libby. Paul, did you want to add anything, or should we go to the next?
I'll just add that I think when we're teaching global citizenship or discussing it with students, we need to go to its roots, which is cosmopolitanism, and really help people to understand that at the root of solving global problems is respecting the sanctity of fellow human beings, and global citizenship was built on that. That's a cosmopolitan approach. It's not a dirty word. It shouldn't be a dirty word. But I think that to really delve into how GC and cosmopolitanism kind of integrate together, I think is a useful approach when we're talking to students about how do we even begin to think about solving some of these issues, global issues that just don't seem to be getting any better. In fact, the doomsday clock has just been set at 90 seconds now. I don't know if everybody's aware of that, but if you're not, you should Google it, the doomsday clock. don't mean to be doom and gloom, but it's a metaphor for just how close we are to having catastrophe upon us in the world. So anyway, Google it and you'll get a good education about that.
Thanks, Paul. Real quick, Pat, before you say the next one, I just feel like I'd be remiss to not mention that using restorative practices in the classroom, especially responsive restorative practices, for students to understand the histories and ancestries of their classmates, to broaden that awareness is key. There's been this theme throughout today of change starts with me, and that includes global change. So I just wanted to throw that in there. Pat.
Mm-hmm. That was great. Thanks, Julia. We have a global panel here, but the next question is really about centering a sort of a US perspective or a Western perspective. How important is it to center global citizenship curriculum outside of a US-based framework? And where does it get anchored? I know a number of you have mentioned the UNESCO and the UN and some of the international organizations that are focused on supporting and nurturing global citizenship. Is that where we look to, or what would your comments and suggestions be?
Libby, Libby, is your hand up again or still? I'm not sure.
No, still, actually, it's still up. Sorry, I've got to take it down, but I'll say something briefly on that. I think, look everywhere. It's happening everywhere. But there are, there certainly are certain, places where there's sort of perhaps a bit more activity, and some of them have been named. There's the work of Fernando Reimers, and there's work all over the place. But I think UNESCO is a good place to go looking as well, because it is a global organization with a big reach, and a lot of those authors are contributing to UNESCO's work as well. There's also in South Korea, there is the Asia Pacific Center for Education and International Understanding, APSEU for short, and that is a clearinghouse for resources, and it's an organization that operates under the auspices of UNESCO. So they have a lot of resources, online training courses and things. So it's a really good place to check into, and they offer lots of webinars and training things and so on.
I would just answer that by saying that I don't think any global citizenship curriculum should be anchored nationalistically, whether it's the States or Canada or anywhere else. So it just it's antithetical to the idea of global citizenship. But as an example, I have followed the curriculum of Oxfam, the global citizenship curriculum of Oxfam, and I would again just Google that. They're a historical organization from just around World War II. I think they're based in Great Britain right now, but they have a phenomenal global citizenship curriculum for K to 12, actually.
And I would add the metaphor that's often used in education circles around windows and mirrors, and I think it's been expanded to include sort of sliding glass doors. So students being able to hear and involve themselves in stories that reflect their own experiences, as well as those experiences of people that are very different from themselves. And so that can be an important framework and an important lens through which teachers can assess their own curriculum. And it was said earlier, it doesn't live just within, social studies or history. And so that's an important point too. All of the disciplines and all of the interdisciplinary approaches can use that windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors as a model for assessing the current curriculum, and then where there might be opportunities to expand perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Pat, what's next?
Yeah. Tiffany poses a question from a practitioner point of view, and some of your work might have touched on this, but how can global citizenship education impact at-risk students that are in a disadvantaged environment? So, being able to sort of access, I guess, the global citizenship education, and then the impact that it might have on those students that might be struggling with, real life and immediate sort of disadvantages when they come into our schools.
This might be naive because I'm not really involved with the funding aspect of schools. But I think especially, and I've experienced this when I take students on study abroad, the transformative experience that they go through when they visit another country, even if it's only for 10 days to 2 weeks, stepping outside of their own local community, maybe for the first time in their lives, not even stepping outside. I'm from Toronto, maybe not even stepping outside of Toronto ever. I could tell you stories of students who have lived such cocooning lives, disadvantaged students, and it's unbelievable how they just blossom when they visit another country. And so I would, if I was king of the world, I would definitely take away a fair portion of the money spent on military and arms buildup, and give it to schools so that they can subsidize or even just fully take their students, especially the disadvantaged students, on a trip abroad, an intentional trip abroad, not just a holiday, but an intentional trip abroad to learn about other cultures, to interact with other cultures. It's just an amazing change that they will go through, and will live with them for the rest of their life. And it will definitely give them a perspective on seeing the world through others' eyes and not just their own.
Yeah, and of course, if we were kings of the world, there wouldn't be disadvantaged children. It would be all different. I think another thing that I found, I've worked in a school that had a lot, like majority of probably disadvantaged students, and I'll get back to my favorite, which is philosophy. Actually, teaching philosophy in schools really, really helps, because students actually get to start sentences with "I think," and they start exploring ideas, and they start sharing ideas and learning about other worldviews, and really exchanging. Getting them to go, actually go to places is amazing when it can be done. And I've seen that as well, and how transformational that can be.
I should add, I shouldn't have actually said king of the world, because of course that's one of the knocks against global citizenship, is global citizens are only interested in a one world government. Exactly. So I take that back. No kings of the world.
We won't buy into that one.
Thank you. Julia, can I pose another one? Bonnie, did you want to share anything on that, or I'll pose a number of questions have revolved around just starting points for this work, and you all provided some sort of general insights around whole school implementation. These questions seem to be more about from a teacher practitioner point of view, so in the classroom. For example, Liam has posted, for example, we live in a fruit orchard area, and the role and fragility of honeybees worldwide would be a great entry point. What local global gateways have you seen used successfully in practice to begin the learning?
Mm-hmm. The best thing, sorry, Bonnie, you go, you had your hand up.
Oh, thanks, Libby. Yeah, great question. And I think this speaks to the importance of partnerships. So no school can do it alone, no teacher can do it alone, no classroom can do it alone. But what are those immediate resources in the neighborhood or in the town or the city? And the honeybee example is a great one. So are there farms nearby where the school can engage in a partnership, or the classroom teacher can engage in a partnership? I worked at a nature-based school, and this was a core part of the curriculum. What are those partnerships that we as a school can seek out to help expand the horizons of our students? So I would just say that's absolutely fundamental. And partnerships are the sort of cautionary tale here is that partnerships are not easy. They often seem easy in theory, but there are challenges. But I think having a clear clarifying expectations on both ends and being clear about kind of what the success outcomes are and what we want students to gain from whatever that individual experience is, or what it's going to look like, and whether it's a one-off or whether it's a longer term partnership or engagement. Just clarifying those expectations with the student at the center of the experience. I would say that's fundamental to partnerships, but that's a really good example. Thanks to that person who asked that question.
Yeah, thanks for that question too. And then really, support everything Bonnie's just offered too there. So I think it's a fantastic example, and it shows that, global citizenship education there isn't a set model. And so what's ideal is for a school to develop its own model that aligns its values to the framework, and doing work on a localized issue like that is far more valuable than any amount of resources that might be delivered to you from a Ministry of Education or whatever, because they're authentic, and they're not only of fantastic use to you in your own school and community, but they're of great interest to other educators and learners as well, so that they can kind of see that local and practical application. So I think just developing your own work around the key principles is the way to go. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Pat, I think we're coming up close to the end of our time. Did everyone get a chance to respond to that one? Because I was kind of looking at the chat at the same time.
There is a specific higher ed question, Julia. I'm not sure if we have time for Paul to maybe share.
Let's do one more.
A minute or two? Okay, that's wonderful. The question is posed as such, North America, mainly the US, is sadly very politically polarized, which is affecting how and what students are being taught. How can higher ed overcome this to create balanced, analytical global citizens?
A minor question.
No, just like 30, if you could just answer that
30
in 30
seconds.
No, but just that, what is the responsibility really at the higher ed level? Not to address all the challenges and wrongs in K-12, but what is the responsibility? What do you see as being the responsibilities of higher ed to nurture global citizenship?
You mentioned the political divisiveness in the States. It just reminds me, the father of our current prime minister, for those of you who aren't aware of Canadian politics, the current prime minister is Justin Trudeau. His father, Pierre Trudeau, I think once famously talked about how the relationship between Canada and the States is that Canada is like the States is like the elephant, and when it sneezes, Canada can moves, I guess, to that sneeze. So we're very aware here about what's going on in the States, and fortunately, in most jurisdictions here, we have not become that divided. It's a very difficult situation, because you have people who were once trusted and respected exhibiting very strange morals and ethics and behaviors that one would not expect of a citizen, not to mention a global citizen. And so I think I'll just harken back to post-secondary education for sure. I don't know about K-12 because I haven't been in K-12 in decades as a student, but post-secondary has lost its focus in terms of character building. It's all about getting a job. What can we do to help students learn how to succeed in a competitive market? And we've lost the soft skills approach, and which are actually global citizenship type attitudes and behaviors, like empathy and respect and civil discourse and a compromise, a willingness to compromise, that even if someone doesn't see your point of view, there's a way to compromise. All of these things that are unfortunately not. And I don't mean to blame the States. There are other countries as well that are turning towards that autocratic way of thinking. But we have to think about what that's doing to our children, the modeling that's doing to our children. So post-secondary, well, I shouldn't say just post-secondary, all schools have a responsibility to counteract what's going on in the political realm. It's tough because this is what they see, and it's hard to counteract that when they're exposed to that all the time. But I don't think we should give up. There's global citizens or a global citizen perspective needs to look at the soft skills that really truly allow us as humans to interact on a positive way with each other.
Thank you so much. Back
Thank
to
you,
you, Julia.
All right, and thank you, Pat. So technically, this is over at 5:20. I did want to give our panelists one last 15-second, literally, opportunity to say anything you might want to say. If you have a current project you'd like people to look up on a website, or if you want to share your email address or anything like that. So let's go ahead and start with Bonnie. Do you have anything you'd like to share? And then we'll go to Libby and then Paul.
Sure. Thank you all for being with us today. Thank you for your commitment to this important work, and thanks to IIRP for pulling us all together around this important topic. And I know you all, IIRP, have a lot of tremendous resources on your website as well. So it's worth a look here. And Libby, Paul, wonderful to meet you. Thanks for your good work too in this area.
Go ahead, Libby.
Oh, yes. Well, look, just thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for just, for tuning in and listening to us. And it's really exciting to have met you and be invited into this. So Paul and Bonnie, I really would like to stay in touch and maybe swap some of our ideas and Paul, I didn't get a chance to write down all of those points that came out from your first experience with global citizenship 25 years ago or something. So I'd really like to follow up on some of that stuff. Feel free, I've put my email address in there, and feel free to connect on LinkedIn as well. Thank you very much. Ngā mihi nui.
Thanks, Libby. Paul?
Yeah, thank you very much. I really enjoyed this panel, and I really appreciate all of the educators out there struggling with this issue of global citizenship and struggling with what's happening in your schools now. I've put my email address in the chat. I know some people are interested in some of the research that I've been doing, and just email me. I'm happy to share with you that research. Thanks again.
All right. Thank you to all three of you. This brings us to the close of our session. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today, and thank all of you out there for attending. Also, thanks again to the Open Society Foundation and the New Press for their generous contributions. Remember to complete your survey right after this session. Also, check out our on-demand sessions, community exhibitor booths, and research poster sessions located in your attendee hub. Please stay connected and continue the conversation by joining other events, including discussion and networking small groups, arts and expression conversations, and other panel discussions. Thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure. Panelists, if you want to hang out maybe for a little bit, just if you can, if you have time. I'm not sure how